Hey there, Teenacity fam. Today, I want to take you all on a trip down memory lane to those childhood days that many of us have spent glued to the captivating tales of the epic Ramayana. Every time I watched an episode, I was reminded of the exemplary conduct of Lord Ram, whether as a devoted son, or a caring brother, or a just ruler. His story deeply influenced how I value and nurture my own relationships. Today, as I stand on the threshold of adulthood, ready to navigate through life's adversity in a world filled with diversity, the importance of being authentic, leading a life of purpose with integrity while creating meaningful connections has never been clearer. As someone who's been both the elder and the little sibling, I've sat through my fair share of lead by example talks from my parents. Back when I was 10, trying to be like Lord Ram felt like a tall order. But now, as I'm growing up and taking on leadership roles at home and at school, it's starting to make a lot more sense. The more I reflect, the more I wonder, what is it about Lord Ram that makes him a timeless source of inspiration for today's youth? It's plain to see that his wisdom isn't just ancient history. It's a beacon guiding us through the complexities of modern life, even in the 21st century. So join me on my quest as I unravel the mysterious but undeniable connection between leadership and mental wellness, because I believe that just like Lord Ram, we all have the power to lead by example and make a difference in the world. In this episode, helping us discover what it truly means to be a leader in today's ever-changing landscape is our esteemed guest, Mr. Mohinish Sinha. He's the cream of the crop in the world of leadership. Sir has been in the game for over 25 years with tons of experience in organizational transformation, leadership development, and coaching. He's like the Yoda of leadership, except he's even cooler. Not only is he a partner at Deloitte India, but as the people and purpose leader, he helps organizations and their management to build the right culture and right leadership, which we'll definitely dive into later. But he's also lent his experience to startups and big short corporations alike. Talk about versatility. From education to oil and gas, banking to IT, you name it, he's conquered it. And when it comes to speaking gigs, let's just say that he's in high demand on the speaking circuit, gracing prestigious HR forums and academic institutions with his wisdom. Oh, and did I mention? He is a social media wizard. His webinars on leadership development are like the Avengers of online learning. They are packed with action and excitement. So with him on board, get ready for some downright awesome conversations that will not only unlock your leadership potential, but also give your mental wellness a serious boost.
That look, I have a limited control on this is what all I can do. And if you do why of that, you realize the only thing you can do is you can work on yourself. And the second is, by way of working on oneself, let me figure out what others see me as. What are their suggestions? I don't need to necessarily listen to it. So that's really what I see, those two qualities as the important qualities needed for mental health.
That's a very enriching perspective, sir. I think one very pertinent point you would mention is that different individuals, they may have varying degrees of understanding of self. And also, I think briefly you touched upon how people understand themselves and want to project themselves. And I think relating to that, something that's become increasingly prevalent in this century for teenagers is that teenagers are very easy to be influenced, at least some of them, if not all. And, studies have shown that peer pressure, things like that, naturally, some individuals are inclined to give in and others are able to better resist and stand their ground because they have a firm belief in their own value system or their own ethics or an understanding of what they want themselves to look like. So my question revolves around how can then developing leadership skills help these teenagers or individuals in establishing greater autonomy for themselves in social interactions, and how can they start developing skills to influence others positively even if they're not in a formal leadership position, whether that be in school or in a society or community, in a colony.
That's a great question. So how does one develop that? So two things that I've seen as a good, simple way to do this, right? The first is find people who are your role models, including at your peer level. I've been lucky. I took an example of Andrew, for example, and throughout my years, I've had extraordinary peers I would look up to. Even in my current work, right? There are some amazing peers who I look up to and say, hey, there's something I can learn from this person or what he or she does. So keeping yourself in a lookout of that, making friends with them, learning from them, seeing what they do, that I think allows us to then understand what good looks like. What does a behavior that I may not be aware at all because never seen it before. But once I look at it, I say, that makes sense. And, and if I'm up close and personal with this person, I'm hanging out with this individual, I see the person in action, it allows me to even interact, understand. And all. That's the first one I would say. The second is leadership is an act, as I mentioned. An act requires effort. So, what is the one thing that you're doing that is courageous, that is little out there? So, it's really pushing boundaries, trying things that take you to the unknown a bit. So, it could be public speaking is a challenge, and I know it's been for many, and it was for me in my early years. Going and standing in front of 1,000 people and speaking out, unstructured stuff, right, without any crutch of a note or whatever else, right? So something that takes you a bit beyond what you are used to. And the idea behind that is you're priming your brain to be comfortable with ambiguity and priming your brain to be comfortable to bring forth the quality of courage. So what I found most useful, I was lucky some 25 odd years ago, one of my colleagues inspired me to do this. And what I did was for 20 plus years, I don't do that as much in the last, say, year or so. Every month, I would immerse myself in something that challenges me. I will do something that really scares the hell out of me in my work, in social environments. So, for example, I promised myself that in 3 months' time, I would play tabla in front of a live audience. And I don't know how to play tabla. I didn't know how to play tabla at that time. So I got a trainer to train me, give me the basics. I practiced and did a lot of that. And then I went live. I did a decent job. I wasn't stellar, but just singing in front of like the professional singer who was singing, and I was giving her a backup through my tabla. I was scared like crazy. But that is an example of what that meant. People sort of said, "Oh, obviously you play tabla regularly." They hardly knew that this was my 3 months and I had gone for a live performance. But similar things, right? Improv, theater. So I've all constantly sort of pushed myself. And what that does is that, as I mentioned, that it allows me to continuously challenge myself when I get to a point where I have to take responsibility, right? So those are the two things that I would say. I know you didn't ask me this question, but I want to just add a piece, is that the rest of the qualities of leadership actually emerge, which is unique to who I am. And each one of us have a unique set of qualities. And part of the leadership journey is trying to figure that out, trying to see, hey, what defines me as a person? So you will notice there is a part that is, you would have heard of terms like self-reflection, really understanding, making notes for myself, making journals. And through that process, discovering who am I and what's important to me. And as a consequence, I would develop my own unique style of it. So, for example, for me, my unique style is I really like to connect with people in a specific way. I really want to understand who they are, right? That's me. That's my signature. That's what I have worked, which is very different from some of the other people or other practitioners in my field that I know, right? But this is unique me. So discovering that unique me through the two things of role model and putting myself out there is the real process of leadership journey.
Very well put, sir. I think everything that you mentioned, it was extremely pertinent to this discussion. And I think something that I'd like to add is that looking for role models in a certain situation, especially for our audience listening here, to be a role model, you do not necessarily need to be one person with a set of all attributes and everything about you being ideal. I think personally in my life, I've picked up from role models from all spheres of life. And from one peer, perhaps I learned something. Their work ethic, perhaps I find to be really, really strong. But there might be other traits of theirs that are not particularly ideal. But I think even from those people, we can pick up a couple of things, pick up a certain habit from here, a certain habit from there. So you may not appreciate everything about a role model, but it's about those little things that you pick up from people around you that inspire you. And then I think you inculcate that in yourself and you try to portray it through your behavior. And at the end of the day, leadership is a process of unlocking all these skills that you do have, all these values that you do have, and nurturing them up to a certain level. And each level you sort of unlock, each time you go up, it's like a video game that you're unlocking more of an audience that's able to relate to you. So a leader might be for a particular classroom, and you might have to grow those skills to be able to lead an entire grade or to be able to lead an entire school and so on and so forth. So I think very well put by you, sir. What you said was very thought provoking. I'd like to ask, like you mentioned, the second point that you mentioned about putting yourself out there. I think that's a very, very interesting practical insight for leaders to sort of expand their abilities and find their true self. But I'd like to ask a question slightly related to that. So, sir, in what ways do individuals who excel in leading and guiding others prioritize their own mental and physical health? Could you please offer some more practical tips and practices that teens can integrate into their daily routines to enhance these abilities?
I acknowledge the fact that the world is getting very complex out there. right? And one of the aspects that we haven't sort of talked about, but is all around us, is that we are bombarded with the amount of data. Just to kind of give you a sense that our brains can at most deal with about 190 bits per second kind of a exposure or something like that. But on average, we are getting bombarded with 240 bits per second. It's overwhelming to our neuroscience. And therefore, the point around maybe 50 years ago when the world was a little slower, the ability for us to process and pick up the right choices, the examples I talked about, taking charge and taking responsibilities, came at very little cost because it was really, I had to kind of manage myself. But now, because of the overwhelm of environment around me, data, phone, being exposed to social media, all of that, it even overwhelms part of our brain. And the direct consequence of that is it affects our own sense of who we are. There is a fascinating study that was done in the US, I think just a few years ago, if I'm not mistaken, around COVID time, that there were a bunch of late school, early college students were put in a room and they were told that, look, you have to sit in the room. It's a completely around that, Adhiveer.
Very true, sir. I think a lot of what our culture brings has been lost, especially in this digital age. I think I can recognize the teenagers and my peers. We are just inherently, I don't know why, but there's a lack of interest in our own culture, in our own, what we call our Sanskriti. And I think personally, I find that quite saddening because there are so many beautiful stories that have been brought out by these scriptures. You hear about the stories of Shikhandi and Mahabharata. And, yesterday was International Women's Day. And there are stories of these great female warriors in India. And I think there are so many of these stories that can beautifully show inclusion and diversity in our own culture. And I think if we can recognize that in our own culture and we can recognize that this has been a part of our values from millennia, then I'm sure that even in today's world, we can inculcate some of these values in our own environments and in our own communities. And we can bring forth values of respect and inclusion for others. So, sir, you're an expert in the field of diversity, in the field of equity, and in the field of inclusion yourself. I think it was a role that you had for quite a significant amount of time. So, sir, could you share with our audience some examples of how this practice is being increasingly adopted, whether it be in schools, in colleges, or in sports, to create a community where diverse voices are heard and valued?
That's a great question. So I think the big work that is happening in all schools, colleges, even in social and sports arena and workplaces as well, is a recognition that, to our earlier question, that there are some unconscious biases that drive a lot of the connects we have. So we tend to connect bases. Oh, are you from this school or are you from this social class, or are you an Indian, or are you from a certain nationality or language? So gender, right? LGBT plus, that whole dimension of people who want to be acknowledged as a different gender, or how they want to be seen as. There are unconscious biases that each one of us have around how people want to express themselves, right? So even in the earlier question, here is the old lady, who's poor, who's going to eat the fruit and give it to me. It's going to be, not healthy and so on, right? I mean, those are biases that we have. So I think big work that has been going on is acknowledging those biases. And as a consequence of it, seeing how can we first put the bias on the table and then have an open conversation to illustrate. The women gender and inclusion of women gender has been one of the most dominant shifts that has been happening in the last decade. I mean, it's been happening for some time now, but in the last decade, it has really picked up in India and certainly across the globe. And the key element around bias in, say, school and colleges were girls don't like STEM courses. They like language courses. And a lot of the girls would be encouraged to not go towards STEM, and the boys would be encouraged not to go towards languages and so on, right? And these biases would sit even in the family, in where you're part of. And I think a lot more appreciation in the educators. So the teachers, the administrative parts of the school, which is the principal and the the administrators, are aware of that those biases show up as the kind of judgment we make on the youngsters. They have been training to make sure that they acknowledge it, right? So that's what we can the best do to these is acknowledge our own biases. The second place where these biases are also showing up is not just the pre-bias, but the bias is in the classroom, right? In the way students would talk to each other, or teachers would talk to them. The choices after school, that the individuals will make on career, on what they would want to go for, etc. So I think there's a lot been happening in that today. Parents are a lot more sensitive about it. Children are, of course, very sensitive. Teachers and educators are more sensitive. And therefore, you're seeing very different sets of people going into unthinkable careers. There are women who are sort of picking up careers in becoming a taxi driver, for example, or a truck driver. There have been cases of that. The second thing that is happening, along with acknowledging the biases, the shifts in the policies that these institutions are making, right? Earlier, we know, good old days, women would not be allowed to vote, for example, or do a certain kind of a program or get into careers like that, right? One of my batchmates, she went into the liquor industry as a salesperson, right? Unthinkable at that time, 30 years ago. She challenged the status quo, and the policies in that company allowed for that. It's okay, right? We believe in it, even though it is not a social norm to have a woman going on selling liquor, and she was in that business. So therefore, the policies have started shifting. Policies have started changing, allowing for these shifts to happen. And third is, which is that there is a constant dialogue. There is a lot more discussion like we are having right now, as well as in environments which are academic, which are administrative, which are government, right? They're talking at the highest level, surfacing the challenges of the system and what you may have heard of as systemic biases, right? That the way certain groups of people are developed, they don't have a chance at all to ever make it into that. So there's a lot more dialogue that is happening around systemic biases in India, in different parts of the world. And those systemic biases, as they are getting talked about, they're getting reconstructed, they're challenged. And newer models are emerging as we speak. So I'm very optimistic about where we are, but we have a long distance to go around it. And the one final point on this, I would say, is interestingly, AI can be a potential aid for us if we use it well, because AI can also be biased, because the person coding that AI may have his or her unconscious bias coded in. But used well, AI could be used to eliminate, identify the biases, identify the systemic biases, and help us to solve it. So we are going into a good place, provided we take the right leadership calls, the right values, and we solve the right problems.
Very well said, sir. I completely agree with you. I think in these sort of institutional roles, there is a huge paradigm shift that has been happening. And as you very rightly mentioned, it's been expedited over the last couple of years. In fact, you mentioned the role of teachers and administrative faculty in this role. And I think in a developing country like India, it's only in these positions that this change can sort of become a part of our upbringing, so that now for future generations, it is a given rather than something that has to be learned. And I think something very interesting that I'm being taught in my course as a subject, of course, we study languages, and something that I hadn't come across in my previous school, but I am now in this new school that I'm in, is that there's a course of poetry that's been taught to us. And there's this poet, Caroline Duffy, and she is a body of work that encompasses of a lot of poems that are sort of reconstructive narratives into ancient Western stories and mythologies. So, we might have heard about the story of Lazarus or Midas or Achilles for that point of view. And what she does is that she sort of recreates these poems with the perspective of the female, who's traditionally shown in a supporting role in those specific stories, but they are now the protagonist, and they're now sort of creating their own story there. And it's very interesting because we were just recently learning about how they sort of break the gender norms and stereotypes. And I think it's a very, very interesting move. And I think, as you said, we're very optimistic for the future. I think it's just a matter of being open-minded. It's just a matter of being empathetic. And it's a matter of redeveloping our belief system to accommodate at the ideology that there are others who are equals and that they should be treated as equals as well. And I think it's a very pertinent thought, sir. And I think this is a great note to end the question and answer segment on. And now I'll take you to a lighter, less serious, more interesting segment of this podcast, which is the rapid fire round. So for the sake of this segment, I'll just be giving you around 3 to 5 seconds to gather your thought and answer these questions, just for an authentic view on your answers. So some interesting questions coming your way. First one being, if you could have a superpower to enhance your leadership skills, what would it be?
Okay. So I'm a big fan of Avengers, and I love Hawkeye. His agility, his rapidity with which he sort of paces himself. So I love that superpower if I could have it.
Perfect, sir. What's the weirdest or most unexpected place that you've ever found inspiration for your leadership?
So once it happened that I had taken a bunch of teenagers on a hike, and the idea was to give them a certain challenge. And then it started raining heavily, so we really couldn't go out. We were sort of stuck. So we went to a small hut which was owned by some villager, and so the 8 or 10 of us, we were huddled in that. Day was getting wasted. It was raining incessantly. So there and then I invented, okay, guys, our leadership act would be clean up this hut and make it livable. The old man was very, very happy. Kids learned something. And I felt saved. Okay.
That's
Unexpected situation. I managed to get something done.
that's quite heartwarming, sir. Very heartwarming instance. This one's a bit tricky. If you had to describe your leadership style using a movie title, what would it be?
I think I would go with Invictus. This idea that whatever is thrown at you, you build something stronger out of it by sheer
Wow.
effort.
Wow. How I think I'll have to watch that movie now
You should. You
after
should.
this
It's a fabulous
podcast.
movie. Yeah.
Right. If you could have dinner with any historical figure that you'd find very interesting to discuss leadership over, what would
Oh,
it be?
Oh, there are two guys. There are plenty actually, but two I've always been fascinated by. One was Richard Feynman, a
Richard
physicist
Chinman.
in Caltech, who died not too long ago. But that time I was not too aware of him. And the second is Buddha. I would love to sit down with both of them and hear their version of why, how do they see the world today, and what would the advice they would have for me.
I'm sure that would be a very, very interesting dinner conversation to have. So what's the weirdest piece of advice you ever received?
Oh yeah, very early on, I was always I got irritated, when I was growing up, when my mother would say, "Sab theek ho jayega, everything will be okay," right? And I said, "How do you know, right? Everything is going to be okay." So it always looked like a weird advice, but it's weirdly true. You leave everything, everything sort of settles in the right way. Weirdly simplistic as it is, I think it's a fascinatingly a wise advice, which I live to even today.
Wow. Wow. I think I've been on the receiving end of that remark also several times, but I think slowly with your experiences as they build up, you start understanding that I think the most pertinent piece of advice that I'd be giving to the teenagers listening to this podcast is that mother is always right.
Oh, mother is always right.
Mother
Absolutely.
is always right. You mentioned how for many years in your life, you used to have this act where you used to give yourself some months to learn some skill or to test yourself or to push your limits,
Yeah.
right? So, what's the most bizarre talent or skill you've ever attempted to learn?
Oh, I can't say it's a bizarre skill, but I picked up in a bizarre sort of a context. Is this was again, I would go to Doordarshan to get a piece of work, and in those days, you basically the producer would say, "Do you know this?" You would say yes, right? And so he asked me, "Look, we need a musician here, a music director here. So
Right.
can you play music?" And I had no clue. And I said yes, as all of 18 or 19 at that time, I think. So great. Now the time has come. The director is asking me, okay, get the musician going. So I had someone who played the keyboard and so on. And the scene was that we had to do this animals, who were sort of going on the screen, and this has to be music. There's sounds of animals that we had to record. So there was a lot of hard work. Finally, the way it happened was that my keyboard player wasn't as good, so he and I, we did some work on this, and then I made all the animal sounds that you can think of.
Oh,
Using the
wow.
keyboard made it more real
Oh,
in that sense, without going to any animal. And those days we never had this benefit of internet to tell us what those
right.
sounds are. So we made an outstanding clip, and the director was happy. He said, "Wow, this is fantastic! You guys solved it." But it just came out from my
That's
not knowing music, and me using animal sounds, voices, using my voice. So
that's very,
that's a
very
skill I kind of
fascinating.
developed there and then. It seemed to work.
All right, so speaking of your 18 or 19-year-old self, the last question to sum this up would be one piece of advice that you'd give yourself when you were around at that time.
Beautiful. So I've always thought about it, right? If there was one thing I could give advice, is I would tell my younger self, stay at one thing little longer. I tended to sort of jump from one skill to the other. Oh, I've learned taekwondo. Okay, now let's move into this. No, no, let's move into that. So I did a lot of great things, but I didn't build depth. So if I go back, I'll remind myself to build depth in something. And I think now I can see that when I build depth, I learn that much more. So that's something I would certainly tell my younger self.
I think very, very well said, sir. I think in our sort of Indian culture, it's embedded that, ye bhi karna hai, ye bhi karna hai. So there's a lot of jumping around to do. But I think if you stick to something for a lengthy period of time, if you have sustained effort in that field, then you truly get a chance not only to find your skill, but to also develop and hone that skill. So I think that's very well mentioned by you, sir.
Thank you.
And as we wrap up, I'd like to introduce the final segment we like to call the words of wisdom. And in this segment, we asked our esteemed guests to share a profound piece of advice or a teaching that they've encountered in their journey. So, sir, for all the teens listening to this podcast, could you share a piece of wisdom or a principle that's been a guiding light for you? Something that our teen listeners can take away from your incredible journey, summed up in a sentence or two.
Very simply, know yourself and be the best version of yourself, not anyone else, just yourself. Each one of us are rock stars in the way we are. We just got to discover who we are and be that best version.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you so very much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your invaluable insights on nurturing team leadership, on promoting inclusivity and diversity. And I think a lot of the things you mentioned are very pertinent and enriching takeaways for myself and everyone listening to this podcast. I think personally, this conversation has been very enlightening, and I'm going to listen to the recording once or twice again to get a deeper understanding of what you said. So I think whatever you've said has made incredible sense to me, and I think it's very inspiring. So thank you very much for sparing your time and joining me, sir.
Thank you, Adhiveer. And I must say, keep on doing this great work. I'm sure it's making a difference to a lot of youngsters. And, that's my example of taking responsibility, right? You're going beyond just my limited area. So well done, Adhiveer. And I'm sure you're an inspiration to many. I certainly feel very inspired to see a youngster doing this great work. So all the very best to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. I think I speak on behalf of all of us when I say that sir's engaging presence and thoughtful contributions have truly enriched this discussion, and I look forward to implementing his wisdom in my quest to empower future leaders and create more inclusive communities. So, Teenacity fam, if you're ready to unleash your inner leader and make some positive changes in your life, and maybe even change the world while you're at it, then hit that subscribe button, because you wouldn't want to miss a single episode of the Teenacity Talks podcast. This is Adhiveer Kapuria signing off for now. Peace out.